We just wanted to grill burgers and celebrate my father-in-law's birthday. Then flashing lights showed up, and guns were pointed at us. One woman on our street decided our family didn't belong. She called it a gang gathering. She called it suspicious. 6 months later, she was still hunting us down. Then she found the one detail that should have stopped her cold. My badge. My name on every patrol car in town. She smiled anyway. My name is Marcus Bell, 43 years old, and for 18 years I've served the city as a police officer, the last 4 as captain of the 3rd precinct. My wife Angela is an ER nurse. We have 2 kids, Malik and Zora, and we'd finally saved enough to buy our dream house in Brookhaven Ridge, a quiet, gated community outside Atlanta. We moved in that spring, proud and hopeful, 2 blocks from a good school and a lake trail Angela loved. We didn't know yet that our new neighborhood came with an unofficial gatekeeper, a woman named Deborah Ashworth, HOA president for 8 straight years, who treated every rule in the bylaws like scripture, and every new face like a threat to be investigated. Angela's father, Otis, was turning 70 that June, and we planned a backyard cookout. Nothing wild, just family, folding chairs, a smoker, and gospel music low enough not to bother anyone. We sent a courtesy notice to the HOA 2 weeks early, exactly as the handbook required, because I've never been the type to skip the paperwork. Deborah replied within the hour. Her email was polite on the surface, but underneath it read like a warning label. Reminders about noise ordinances, parking restrictions, grill placement, and a line that stuck with me. We like to keep Brookhaven Ridge feeling like the neighborhood it's always been. I brushed it off as HOA busybody nonsense. Every development has one. Angela had heard worse from her old apartment board. We figured as long as we followed the rules, there was nothing to worry about. I was wrong about how little the rules would actually matter to Deborah, our neighbor Mrs. A widow in her 70s who'd lived on the street longer than anyone, waved us over one afternoon while we unloaded groceries. She lowered her voice like she was passing state secrets and said, "Watch that woman. She ran off the Okafors 2 years ago. Nice family." I asked what happened to the Okafors. Mrs. said something about noise complaints that turned into police visits that turned into a for sale sign in 3 months flat. She didn't finish the story before her granddaughter called her inside. But the seed was planted, and it wouldn't stop growing. At the next HOA meeting, I watched Deborah run the room like a courtroom, gaveling down questions, cutting off anyone who challenged a rule. She had 2 board members, Linda and Pete, who nodded along to everything she said without ever glancing at the actual bylaws printed in front of them. When I raised my hand to ask about the community fund balance, a routine question, nothing pointed. Deborah's smile tightened for exactly 1 second before she said the topic was tabled for another time. Angela squeezed my knee under the table, a silent "don't start something." Walking home that night, Angela admitted she'd felt it too. Something clenched and careful in the way Deborah looked at us during introductions, like she was cataloging us instead of welcoming us. I told her I'd dealt with worse on patrol. I didn't yet understand this wasn't patrol. This was our home. 2 days before the cookout, Deborah showed up unannounced at our door, holding a laminated copy of the noise ordinance, insisting she just wanted to be neighborly about expectations. She stood on our porch measuring our yard with her eyes, lingering on the smoker like it was contraband. I thanked her for the visit and reminded her we'd already submitted the courtesy notice, approved and dated. She nodded, said "wonderful" in a tone that suggested the opposite, and left a business card with her cell number in case anything came up. Something came up faster than either of us expected. Malik, 16 and always observant, mentioned that Tyler, Deborah's own son, had told him at the community pool that his mother kept a spreadsheet, an actual spreadsheet, tracking which houses got extra visits from her. Ours, apparently, had been added the week we moved our furniture in. I didn't want to believe a grown woman kept surveillance notes on her neighbors like a landlord tracking rent. But Tyler wasn't the type to make things up, and Malik trusted him. I filed it away, the way I file away every small inconsistent detail on a case before it becomes a pattern. Angela started noticing Deborah's SUV slow rolling past our house most evenings around 6. Right when we'd be in the driveway unloading the car after work. It wasn't illegal, its own. But it happened every single day. And patterns like that don't happen by accident. The morning of the cookout, I woke up early to season the ribs, feeling nothing but the good kind of nervous, the kind where you want your father-in-law's birthday to be perfect. Angela hung string lights across the patio. Zora blew up balloons. For a few hours, Brookhaven Ridge felt like hours. By early afternoon, the yard was full. Angela's sisters, my brother David, cousins with foil trays, kids cannonballing into the inflatable pool, Otis holding court in his lawn chair like the king he felt like turning 70. The smoker filled the block with hickory smoke. It was, honestly, a beautiful day. Around 3 o'clock, Deborah's SUV parked directly across the street, engine idling far longer than it needed to. Angela caught me watching it and told me to relax, that it was Otis's birthday, not the day to worry about a nosy neighbor. I tried. Let it go. 3:40. A Brookhaven Ridge patrol contractor, private security the HOA paid for, walked up our driveway with a clipboard, saying he'd received a complaint about excessive noise and vehicle count. I counted 6 cars, all parked legally in our driveway and along our own frontage. Nothing blocked. I explained calmly, professionally, that everything was within code. Showed him our approved event notice on my phone. He looked embarrassed, said he was just following up on a call from a resident, and left without writing anything. I already had a guess about who placed that call. 40 minutes later, David pulled me aside, phone in hand, showing me a photo he'd taken without me noticing. Deborah standing at the edge of her lawn with binoculars, angled directly at our backyard. Not glancing over casually. Watching. Methodically, the way you'd surveil a target. Not a party. I told myself she was probably just checking the noise levels, doing her HOA duty a little too intensely. Angela wasn't as generous. She's not counting decibels. Marcus, she said quietly. She's counting us. I didn't have a good answer for that, so I went back to the grill. By 5, the party had settled into its rhythm. Otis telling stories about growing up in Alabama, my nephew doing cannonballs, gospel playing low from a speaker on the porch rail. It was, by any honest measure, quiet, joyful, Completely unremarkable family gathering. That should have been the end of the story. The 5:20, 3 patrol cars turned onto our street. Lights flashing. No sirens. My stomach dropped before my brain caught up. The old instinct from years on the job recognizing the shape of the moment before I could name it. Every conversation in the backyard stopped at once. 4 officers approached our fence. Hands resting near their holsters. Faces set in the careful blankness cops wear when they don't yet know what they're walking into. The lead officer, young, maybe 2 years on the job, called out, "We got a call about an armed disturbance at this address." Armed disturbance. Ice water. My father-in-law's birthday cake sat half-cut on the table behind me. Kids were still in the pool. And 4 officers stood at my gate with their hands hovering near their weapons because someone had told dispatch there were guns in my backyard. I raised both hands slowly, told them exactly who I was and what agency I worked for, watched the lead officer's eyes flicker with recognition and confusion in the same second. "Captain Bell?" he said. I nodded. "This is my family." The tension didn't fully break. Not yet, because protocol doesn't care who you are until it's confirmed. They still had to check. 2 officers walked the perimeter of my own backyard while my relatives stood frozen. My niece crying quietly against her mother's leg. Otis gripping his cane like he might need it. It took 11 minutes to clear the scene, 11 minutes that felt like 11 hours, before the officers apologized, visibly rattled, and told me the call had described multiple black males with a rifle-style weapon in the backyard. The only rifle-shaped object present was my long-handled meat thermometer. The lead officer, Officer Nguyen, looked as sick about it as I felt, and I recognized him then, a rookie I'd mentored 2 years earlier during his field training. "Captain, I'm sorry," he said, low enough the others didn't hear. Dispatch flagged it priority. We had no choice but to respond hot. I asked who made the call. Citing procedure, but I didn't need him to say it. Across the street, Deborah stood at her mailbox with her arms crossed, watching the whole scene with an expression that wasn't shock. Wasn't concern, it was something closer to satisfaction. Angela walked straight toward her, and for a second I thought I'd have to physically intervene. But Angela just stopped 3 feet away and asked, flat and controlled, "Did you call the police on my father's birthday party?" Deborah's chin lifted. "I reported what I saw. That's my right as a resident." "What you saw was a cookout," Angela said. "Cake and lawn chairs." Deborah didn't blink. I told them what looked concerning. "I'm not required to know for certain. That's the police's job to sort out." She said it like she'd rehearsed it in a mirror. Otis, 70 years old and still sharp as a blade, walked up slowly and said the only thing that landed harder than anger could have. "Ma'am, I fought in a war so my grandkids wouldn't have to explain their own backyard to strangers with guns. You should be ashamed." Deborah looked away first. The officers left with quiet apologies and Nguyen's card in my hand. Promised to follow up on the dispatch log. The party didn't resume the way it had been. Otis blew out his candles anyway, because he refused to let one woman steal his birthday. But the joy in the yard had a crack in it now. That night, after everyone left, Angela and I sat at the kitchen table replaying it, trying to understand how family with a birthday cake became armed disturbance, in the mouth of a dispatcher. I pulled up the non-emergency reporting portal on my laptop, the same one my own department used, and started digging. I found it within 20 minutes. A call logged at 5:04 p.m. from a resident line registered to Deborah Ashworth. Transcript flagged as unverified. Escalated per caller insistence. The caller had specifically used the phrase possible firearm, a phrase that automatically triggers a heightened response protocol. She knew exactly what those words would do. I'd spent enough years reading dispatch transcripts to know the difference between panic and calculation. Panic sounds messy, half-formed sentences, background noise, uncertainty. This transcript read clean, deliberate, each detail chosen for maximum response. Someone who didn't know the system wouldn't have known which words to use. She knew. I brought the transcript to David the next morning, and he went quiet in a way I rarely see from my brother. She weaponized the system, he said. She used the exact language that gets SWAT called instead of a patrol car. I hadn't said the word SWAT yet. He was right that it could have gone there. Angela wanted to march straight to the HOA board and demand Deborah's removal. I told her we needed more than outrage. We needed a pattern, something undeniable, something that would hold up if Deborah tried to spin this as one isolated misunderstanding. My instincts, on duty or off, told me this wasn't isolated. I thought of the Okafors, the family Mrs. Alvarez mentioned who'd left 3 months after noise complaints turned into police visits. If Deborah had done this before, there would be a record somewhere. Dispatch logs don't disappear, and neither do the families who lived through them, wherever they'd scattered to now. I called an old colleague in records and asked, off the books, for any calls originating from Brookhaven Ridge over the past 3 years tagged with escalated language. She said she'd look, but warned me it could take a few days, and reminded me I was treading close to a line I usually enforced, not crossed. Meanwhile, Deborah wasn't finished. 2 days after the party, we received an official HOA violation notice, a $200 fine for excessive noise and unauthorized gathering size, despite our event being pre-approved in writing. The notice was signed by Deborah herself, dated the same afternoon as the cookout, time-stamped before the police even left. She'd filed the fine before the officers finished apologizing to me in my own driveway. That timeline alone told me everything about her intentions. This was never about noise. It was about making sure there was a paper trail justifying the police call after the fact, in case anyone asked questions later. I appealed the fine through the HOA's own process, attaching the approved event notice as proof. Linda, one of Deborah's rubber stamp board members, called to say the appeal would be reviewed at the next meeting, a month away, conveniently long enough for the fine to accrue late fees if we didn't just pay it. Mrs. on our door that evening with a manila folder in her hands, the kind of nervous energy of someone finally deciding to say something she'd been sitting on for years. I kept some things, she said, about the Okafors. Do more when it happened. Inside the folder were photocopied flyers Deborah had circulated years earlier, warning residents about unusual foot traffic near the Okafor house, alongside a printed email chain where Deborah pushed the board to install a camera pointed directly at their driveway, citing safety concerns no one else on the street shared. Mrs. Okafors had done nothing wrong. Quiet family. 2 working parents. A teenage son who mowed half the neighborhood's lawns for extra cash. But 3 police visits in 4 months. each one sparked by Deborah's calls. Wore them down until they sold at a loss just to leave. I asked if she knew where the Okafors lived now. She didn't, but she remembered the husband's name, Emeka, and that he'd worked in IT for a hospital system. It wasn't much, but in my line of work, a name and an employer was often enough of a thread to pull. I found Emeka Okafor's professional profile within the hour, same industry. New city 2 states over. I debated whether reaching out was overstepping. A private citizen digging into another family's old wounds. But something told me he deserved to know he wasn't the only one, and that this time, someone was pushing back. My message to him was careful, professional, explaining who I was and what had happened at our cookout. His reply came back within a day. Longer than I expected. Raw in a way that told me the wound hadn't closed. "I've waited 3 years for someone to believe me," he wrote. "Thank you." Emeka's account matched Mrs. Alvarez's almost exactly. Surveillance photos slipped under his door. Complaints about grass length measured to the quarter-inch while identical. Violations went unenforced 2 houses down. And finally a call that brought 4 squad cars for a backyard basketball hoop mistaken. Deborah claimed, for loitering. He'd tried appealing to the HOA board back then too. And gotten the same runaround. Meetings postponed. Appeals under review. Fines quietly compounding until leaving felt cheaper than fighting. He sent me the email trail as proof. The same clipped, procedural tone I now recognized instantly in Deborah's messages to us. Reading his emails side by side with mine felt like reading the same crime scene photographed years apart. Same phrasing. Same insistence that everything was for the community's safety. This wasn't a woman losing her temper once. This was a method, refined over years, aimed at whoever she decided didn't belong. I asked Emeka if he'd be willing to put his story in writing. Formally, if it ever came to that. He hesitated. He'd moved on, built a new life, didn't want to reopen old wounds for nothing. I told him I understood, and meant it, but asked him to at least think about it. Angela, meanwhile, had been quietly talking to other neighbors, the ones who'd lived there longest, careful not to tip our hand. 2 more names came up, a Filipino family who'd left after a similar pattern, and a Latina single mother who still lived 2 streets over, visibly anxious whenever Deborah's name came up. The single mother, Rosa, agreed to talk to Angela over coffee, though she made clear she was terrified of retaliation. She said Deborah had once told the board Rosa's late-night nursing shifts made her an unpredictable presence in the neighborhood. Enough to get her flagged for a welfare check she never asked for. A welfare check, in my professional opinion, is not something you request over someone's work schedule. It's a tool, and like any tool, it can be misused by someone who understands exactly which levers of the system respond fastest to fear. Deborah understood those levers better than most cops I've trained. I started keeping a private file, not official, not yet actionable, but organized the way I organize any case that isn't ready for daylight. Dates. Screenshots. Emeka's testimony. It wasn't proof of a crime yet, but it was the shape of something rotten underneath a nice lawn. At the next HOA meeting, I showed up with the folder tucked under my arm, unopened, just to see how Deborah would react to my presence. She greeted me with a smile so practiced it barely moved her face and said, "Marcus, glad you could make it. I hope there's no hard feelings." I told her, evenly, that there were no hard feelings, just questions. I asked, publicly, why the noise fine had been filed and signed before the responding officers had even left our property. The room went quiet. Pete suddenly found his shoes very interesting. Deborah's smile didn't waver, but her eyes did. "I filed it preemptively," she said, "based on the information available to me at the time." I asked what information exactly justified describing a birthday cookout as an armed disturbance. She said she'd seen something concerning and had a duty to report it. The same rehearsed line she'd used in my driveway. A woman near the back, someone I didn't recognize yet, spoke up before I could press further. "You said the same thing about the Okafors," she said. The room turned toward her. Deborah's composure cracked for half a second. A flicker, gone almost as fast as it appeared. But I caught it. The woman introduced herself afterward as Rachel Kim, a local reporter who'd covered housing discrimination stories for years and happened to be house hunting in the area when a friend mentioned the meeting. She hadn't come looking for a story. She'd found one anyway, the way good reporters always seem to. Rachel and I exchanged numbers in the parking lot. Both of us careful, professional, neither wanting to move too fast. She'd covered HOA misconduct before and said patterns like this rarely stayed contained to one family. There were usually more victims, and usually a paper trail somewhere the HOA hadn't managed to bury. 2 days later, Rachel called with something that made my stomach tighten. She'd pulled county property records and found that Deborah's last official re-election as HOA president was 8 years ago, and under the association's own bylaws, presidents were required to stand for re-election every 2 years. Deborah had simply no election notices, no documented vote counts for 3 consecutive cycles. Just Deborah, unopposed and unquestioned, running the board like a fiefdom while newer residents like us assumed the position had been properly, democratically earned. It hadn't been earned at all. It had simply never been contested. I brought this to Linda privately, careful with my tone, framing it as a genuine question rather than an accusation. Linda went pale and admitted, quietly, that she'd raised the re-election issue with Deborah 2 years back and been told the board decided continuity was more important right now. Linda hadn't pushed back. "She's not someone you push back on," Linda admitted, glancing toward the door like Deborah might walk in any second. "She controls the reserve fund reports. She controls the vendor contracts. Nobody wants to be the reason maintenance stops getting done." Fear, I realized, wasn't incidental to Deborah's power. It was the foundation of it. That word, reserve fund, snagged in my memory. The same fund I'd asked about at my very first HOA meeting. The question Deborah had tabled without answer. I asked Linda directly whether she'd ever actually seen a full financial statement. She admitted she hadn't. Not a complete one. Not in years. "I've built enough cases to know that unaccountable power and unaccountable money tend to travel together." If Deborah had rigged her own position for 8 years, the question wasn't whether she'd also touched the money, it was how much, and how carefully she'd covered it, and who else knew and stayed silent. Angela worried I was getting pulled into something bigger than a backyard cookout deserved, turning a birthday party into an investigation. Maybe she was right. still sitting unpaid on our account, accruing interest, and Deborah still lived across the street with binoculars and a spreadsheet. I requested, formally and in writing as a homeowner, a full financial disclosure of the HOA's reserve fund for the past 3 years, citing the association's own bylaws, which I'd finally read cover to cover. Deborah had 30 days to respond under the rules she herself had once waved in my face. She responded in 9, unusually fast for someone who'd let my noise appeal sit for a month. The document she sent was heavily summarized, missing itemized vendor names, missing receipts, missing the line-by-line detail the bylaws actually required. It read like something designed to look complete without actually being complete. I forwarded it to David, who'd spent a decade in forensic accounting before switching careers, and he called me within an hour, laughing without any humor in it. "Marcus, this isn't a financial statement," he said. "This is a decoy. Consecutive miscellaneous landscaping entries over $10,000 each." David flagged 11 suspicious entries across 2 years, vendor payments to companies with no public registration, reimbursements categorized vaguely as community enhancement, and a recurring monthly withdrawal that didn't match any service the neighborhood actually received. Whatever Deborah was hiding, it wasn't sloppy. It was patient, and it was substantial. I felt the old familiar click. The one I get on a real case when scattered facts start locking into a single shape. This was never just about a cookout, or noise, or race, though all of that was very real and very present. It was about a woman who'd built an unaccountable kingdom, and defended it with fear. For a few weeks after that meeting, things went quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence I'd learned on the job to distrust rather than welcome. No new fines. At 6 p.m. Deborah didn't so much as wave when we crossed paths at the mailbox. I kept building my file anyway. Rachel used the lull to file public records requests through the county, since some HOA documentation, oddly, brushed up against municipal filing requirements Deborah likely didn't know existed. Emeka finally agreed to put his account in writing, saying he'd talked it over with his wife and decided silence had protected no one. Rosa agreed too, on the condition her name stayed out of anything public until absolutely necessary. She still worked nights, still worried about retaliation from a woman with apparent influence over which houses got extra visits. I promised her I understood, and that no one would use her name without her permission. Angela and I used the quiet to actually enjoy our house again. If only briefly. Zora's swim lessons, Malik's junior varsity tryouts, Otis staying an extra week just to relax on the porch he'd started calling his spot. For a little while, Brookhaven Ridge almost felt like the neighborhood we'd hoped for. I should have known better than to trust the quiet. Deborah wasn't backing down. She was recalculating, the way a cornered person recalculates rather than surrenders, especially a person who'd spent 8 years believing the rules existed for everyone except her. The stillness wasn't peace. It was a woman reloading. Mrs. One evening, voice tight, saying she'd seen Deborah's husband Richard loading boxes into his car at odd hours, and that the two of them had been arguing loudly enough for it to carry across 2 lawns. I filed it away without much weight. Marriages had bad weeks. It wasn't my business. It became my business 3 days later, when Richard himself knocked on our door, alone, holding a thin manila envelope and looking like a man who hadn't slept well in weeks. I don't agree with what my wife's been doing, he said quietly. I think you should see this before it's too late. Inside the envelope were printed bank statements from a personal account Richard had discovered while doing their joint taxes. An account under Deborah's maiden name.
Receiving irregular deposits that matched. Almost dollar for dollar. The suspicious landscaping and community enhancement withdrawals David had flagged from the HOA's own reserve fund.
Richard said he'd confronted her about it 2 weeks earlier, and she told him it was compensation she deserved, 4 years of unpaid labor running the association. He didn't buy it. Her before this, for reasons that had nothing to do with money, but this made the decision final. I thanked him, carefully, aware that a spouse's testimony carried weight but also complexity, and that using it wrong could blow up in everyone's face. I told him I needed to verify what he'd given me through proper channels before anything became public. He nodded, said he understood, and left without asking for anything in return. That night I called Rachel and told her, carefully, what Richard had brought us. She went quiet for a long moment before saying what I'd already started to suspect. This was no longer just a homeowner dispute or even a discrimination story. If the numbers held up, this was embezzlement, plain and documented. I brought everything to a colleague in financial crimes the next morning. Someone I trusted to handle it by the book. No shortcuts. Nothing that could later be thrown out on a technicality because I'd let personal anger cut corners. She looked over the file and said, flatly, this is enough to open something. Enough to open something isn't the same as enough to end something, and I knew that better than anyone. Cases like this take time, subpoenas for bank records, verification of vendor legitimacy, formal interviews. Deborah was still HOA president. She still had power over our street. And she still didn't know what was coming. Angela worried, reasonably, that once an investigation started, Deborah would only escalate further, especially against us specifically, since we were the ones who'd triggered the whole unraveling. I told her she wasn't wrong to worry. I also told her I wasn't going to let fear decide how we lived in our own home. We decided, as a family, to keep living normally: school, work, weekend barbecues, Otis's visits, while quietly letting the investigation run its course behind the scenes. What none of us expected was how fast, and how personally, Deborah would come at us once she realized the ground beneath her was shifting. The first sign came through Malik. A woman he didn't recognize approached him outside the community pool, asking pointed questions about what his father did for work and whether our family had always lived in nice neighborhoods. He came home rattled, describing her clearly enough that we knew immediately. Deborah's sister, visiting from out of state. Angela was furious in a way I rarely see from her, calm on the surface and shaking underneath. Approaching a 16-year-old, fishing for information through a teenager because the adults wouldn't give her what she wanted. Crossed a line even Deborah hadn't crossed directly yet. Told me she was getting desperate. I called a lawyer the next morning. Not because I wanted to escalate unnecessarily, but because desperate people make dangerous decisions. And I needed our family protected on paper as well as in practice. The lawyer, a sharp woman named Priya Shah who specialized in housing discrimination, took the case within a day. Priya reviewed everything: the dispatch transcript, the fine timeline, Emika's account, Rose's account, David's financial flags, Richard's bank statements, and told us plainly that we had grounds for both a civil complaint against the HOA and a formal fair housing investigation, if we chose to pursue it. We chose to pursue it. Deborah, somehow, learned about the lawyer within days. Small neighborhoods leak information fast. And I suspected Linda or Pete, terrified and hoping to stay in Deborah's good graces, tipped her off. Her response wasn't panic. It was a counterattack. Swift and calculated. Exactly the kind I'd started to expect from her. She filed a formal complaint against me with my own department, alleging I had used my position to intimidate a private citizen during the initial police response, twisting the fact that I'd calmly identified myself as some kind of coercive threat display. It was baseless, but baseless complaints still require formal review. My chief called me in personally, not accusatory, just procedural, explaining he had to log and investigate it regardless of how thin it looked. I told him everything, the whole file, months of documentation, and watched his expression shift from routine annoyance to genuine concern the further we got into it. He cleared me within the week. The complaint dismissed as unsubstantiated after Nguyen and the other responding officers corroborated that I'd been calm, cooperative, and entirely appropriate throughout. But the process cost me 2 sleepless nights and reminded me exactly how easily Deborah could weaponize institutions she didn't even fully understand. Undeterred, Deborah shifted targets. She filed a noise complaint against Rosa 2 streets over, timed suspiciously close to when Rosa had quietly agreed to speak with Angela. Then a maintenance violation against Mrs. Alvarez's fence. A fence that had stood unchanged for 6 years without a single prior complaint from anyone. It wasn't subtle, dressed up in bureaucratic language. And every person she targeted happened to be someone connected, even loosely, to the growing case against her. I started to understand that Deborah wasn't just controlling. She was, in her own mind, at war. And she intended to win by attrition. Priya advised us to document every single retaliatory act methodically, since a pattern of targeting witnesses after they cooperated would strengthen our case significantly, especially in a fair housing context. I already had the instinct built into me from 20 years of casework. I just hated that I had to use it on my own street. Rosa called Angela in tears one night, saying she wanted to withdraw her statement, that the fine and the pointed looks from Deborah at the mailbox weren't worth the fight, that she had her kids to think about and couldn't afford a prolonged legal battle over principle alone. Angela didn't push her. Instead, Angela drove over with dinner, sat with Rosa for 2 hours, and told her honestly that no one would think less of her for stepping back, that this wasn't her fight to carry alone. Rosa didn't withdraw entirely, but she asked to stay anonymous as long as possible. We respected that fully. Emeka, from 2 states away, felt no such hesitation once he learned Deborah was retaliating against current residents. She did this to us with no consequences, he told me over the phone, voice hard in a way it hadn't been before. If she's still doing it, somebody needs to actually stop her. Rachel's story finally cleared editorial review and published, carefully worded, fact-checked, anchored in documented complaints rather than accusations, focusing on the pattern of HOA-enabled harassment rather than sensationalizing any single family. It didn't name Deborah directly yet, citing pending investigation, but anyone in Brookhaven Ridge knew exactly who it described. The article spread through the neighborhood group chat within hours. And for the first time, other residents started coming forward, small stories, things people had shrugged off individually. A biracial couple fined for a flag Deborah deemed inappropriate. An elderly Korean couple who'd been reported for suspicious gatherings that turned out to be church study groups. None of these stories alone would have been enough. Together, laid side by side with dates and details, they painted a portrait no reasonable person could dismiss as coincidence. Priya began compiling them formally, and within a week we had 7 separate households willing to at least speak with investigators, even if not all publicly. Deborah's response was to call an emergency HOA meeting, framing it as a chance to address recent misinformation and restore trust in leadership. She clearly intended to control the narrative before it spiraled further. Standing at the podium in a blazer sharp enough to look like armor, prepared with a folder of her own. The meeting hall was fuller than I'd ever seen it. Residents packed into folding chairs, some standing along the walls. Deborah opened with a practice speech about community, safety, and the burden of responsible leadership, never once mentioning a fine, a police call, or a single name from Rachel's article directly. Then Pete, of all people, the board member who'd spent months nodding silently along with everything Deborah said, stood up and asked, voice shaking but audible, why the reserve fund hadn't been fully disclosed despite a formal homeowner request months earlier. The room went dead silent. Deborah's composure flickered. Hard. For the first time. I have nothing to hide, she said. Too quickly. Too sharply. The practice calm cracking at the edges. The fund is being reviewed internally. These allegations are politically motivated. Someone in the back muttered by who, and a ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the crowd. Deborah's eyes scanned the room. Hunting for allies, she found fewer than she expected. Linda, seated beside her, stared fixedly at her own hands. Richard wasn't there at all. He'd already moved out, staying with his brother, and everyone in the room seemed to know it. The absence louder than any accusation could have been. Deborah stood alone at that podium. I raised my hand, waited to be called on out of professional habit, even in a room I had every right to speak in, and asked the question I'd been holding for months. Deborah, when was the last time this community actually held a contested election for HOA president? The silence deepened further. She said the board had unanimously agreed continuity served everyone best. The same phrase Linda had repeated privately, revealing it had always been a scripted excuse rather than a genuine explanation. Someone else asked to see the minutes proving that unanimous agreement. Deborah said the minutes were being organized. They didn't exist. Everyone understood that. The meeting ended without resolution. Technically, but something had shifted permanently in that room. For the first time in 8 years, residents weren't just following Deborah's lead out of habit or fear. They were asking questions out loud, in public, in front of each other, and questions like that don't go back to sleep. Deborah cornered me in the parking lot afterward, dropping the polished HOA president mask entirely for the first time since we'd moved in. You think you're clever, she said, low and sharp. Coming in here with your badge, thinking that makes you untouchable. I've dealt with people like you before. I let her finish. People like me, I repeated. Calm. The way I trained myself to stay calm with agitated suspects for 2 decades. You mean homeowners? People who read the bylaws you clearly hoped nobody would. She didn't answer that. She just got in her car and drove off faster than the street's own speed limit allowed. That night, Angela and I sat on the porch long after the kids were asleep, and for the first time in months, we let ourselves talk about it honestly, not as a case, not as a fight, just as two exhausted people who'd moved into a house hoping for peace and found a battle instead. "Do you regret buying here?" she asked. I thought about it honestly before answering. I didn't regret the house. I regretted, briefly, that people like Deborah existed in enough rooms with enough power to make good families doubt whether they belonged somewhere they'd worked their whole lives to afford. That anger I kept. The Financial Crimes Review David and I had quietly fed into moved faster than expected once Deborah's own bank records, subpoenaed through the formal complaint Priya filed, corroborated everything Richard had handed us weeks earlier. The deposits matched. The timing matched. Back to shell accounts Deborah controlled personally. Detective Ramirez, assigned to the embezzlement case, called me in for an interview not as a suspect but as a witness, given my early role in flagging the discrepancies. I walked her through the file methodically, careful to stay factual, careful not to let months of personal frustration bleed into the official record. She told me, off the record, that the total misappropriated funds over 3 years likely exceeded $90,000, funneled through vague landscaping and community enhancement line items into an account under Deborah's maiden name. $90,000, quietly siphoned from a fund every homeowner in Brookhaven Ridge paid into monthly without question. Meanwhile, Deborah escalated her personal campaign against us, specifically filing a third fine, this one alleging our security cameras, standard doorbell cameras, identical to half the houses on the block, violated resident privacy expectations. Priya flagged it immediately as retaliatory, adding it to the growing fair housing complaint file. Tyler, Deborah's own son, showed up at our door one evening, visibly uncomfortable, saying he wanted to apologize on his mother's behalf even though she hadn't asked him to. He told Malik privately that his mother had been drinking more, sleeping less, and muttering about protecting what she built, like Brookhaven Ridge was hers alone. I felt something close to pity underneath my anger, watching a teenager carry the weight of his mother's unraveling, showing up at the doorstep of a family she'd terrorized to offer an apology that wasn't his to give. I thanked him, told him none of this was his fault, and meant every word of it. The county's Fair Housing Office formally opened an investigation the following week, citing the pattern documented across multiple households. Us, the Okafors, Rosa, the Korean couple, and 2 others who'd come forward after Rachel's article. Deborah received official notice by certified mail, the kind that requires a signature to confirm delivery. She refused to sign for it twice, according to the postal worker, forcing a third delivery attempt with a supervisor present. It was a small, almost childish act of resistance, but it told me everything about where her head was, not accepting reality so much as postponing the moment she had to face it. Linda resigned from the board 3 days later, quietly, without fanfare, sending a brief email to remaining residents citing personal reasons. Pete followed a week after, publicly this time, standing up at a hastily called meeting to say he could no longer, in good conscience, serve alongside someone under active investigation for financial fraud. with 2 board seats empty and a financial fraud investigation underway. Brookhaven Ridge's bylaws technically required an emergency election to fill the vacancies. An election Deborah could not legally control or postpone under the rules she'd ignored for 8 years. For the first time since we'd moved in, the rules finally worked for us. Rosa, watching the momentum shift, finally agreed to let her name be used publicly, saying she didn't want to hide anymore now that others had stepped forward first. Emeka flew in for the emergency meeting himself, saying he needed to see this in person after 3 years of wondering if anyone would ever believe him. The night of the election meeting, the community hall was fuller than I'd ever seen it. Folding chairs spilling into the hallway, people standing along the back wall, phones out recording for accountability. Deborah sat in the front row, alone. Richard's absence beside her now permanent. Tyler seated 3 rows back instead. Priya opened by walking the room through the documented timeline, careful and factual, letting the dates and dollar amounts speak louder than any accusation could. Rachel sat near the front with a notepad, no longer just covering the story but watching, like everyone else, the arc of it finally bending toward consequence. Emeka spoke first, calm despite 3 years of waiting for this moment, describing the surveillance photos, the manufactured complaints, the slow bleed of fines that pushed his family out of a home they'd loved. His voice cracked only once, on the word belonged, and the room sat in absolute, respectful silence. Rosa spoke next, hands shaking around her notes but her voice steady, describing the welfare check called over her night shifts, the fear of losing housing over nothing more than working hours that didn't match Deborah's idea of a normal family. Several people in the audience wiped their eyes without hiding it. Then it was my turn. I told them about Otis's birthday, about 4 squad cars and hands hovering near holsters over a meat thermometer, about 11 minutes that felt like 11 hours while my niece cried against her mother's leg. I told them I knew exactly how close it could have gone wrong. I've responded to calls like that one, I told the room. I know how they end sometimes, when the person on the other end doesn't have a badge in his back pocket to slow things down. My family was lucky. The Okafors weren't as lucky. Rosa wasn't. No one answered. No one needed to. Deborah stood then, uninvited, and tried one last time to reframe everything: misunderstandings, differing perspectives on safety, a few disgruntled former residents. But her voice had lost the authority it once carried in that room, and halfway through, someone near the back simply said, loud enough to carry, "Just resign." Deborah. Nobody objected. She sat back down, pale, hands gripping the folder in her lap so tightly her knuckles whitened. For the first time since I'd known her, Deborah Ashworth had absolutely nothing prepared to say. The silence that followed wasn't dramatic or explosive. It was worse for her. It was simply indifference. A room moving on without her. The emergency election proceeded exactly as the bylaws required. Something that hadn't happened in 8 years. Mrs. of all people, was nominated from the floor and accepted, saying at 74 she had nothing left to lose and a lot of years of watching this go wrong to make up for. She won unanimously, alongside 2 newer residents committed to full financial transparency and equal enforcement of every rule, regardless of who lived where. It wasn't flashy. It was simply, finally, the neighborhood governing itself the way it always should have, without one woman's fear tactics deciding who felt safe. Deborah didn't stay for the vote count. She left partway through Mrs. Alvarez's acceptance speech, slipping out the side door alone, her car peeling out of the lot faster than the street speed limit allowed. Same as the night I'd confronted her in the parking lot weeks earlier. Some patterns never change. The following morning, county investigators executed a formal request for Deborah's financial records tied to the HOA account. Working alongside the embezzlement case Detective Ramirez had been building for weeks. Richard, cooperating fully now that he'd separated from her, provided additional documentation that closed several remaining gaps in the timeline. Word moved through Brookhaven Ridge the way it always does in small communities. Fast, half-accurate, endlessly discussed at mailboxes and driveways. Some residents felt vindicated. Others felt embarrassed for how long they deferred to her without question. A few, quietly, admitted they'd been afraid to challenge her. The same fear Linda had described. Angela and I stayed mostly quiet through the gossip, letting the facts do the talking rather than adding fuel neither of us wanted to manage. Otis, visiting again for the weekend, just shook his head at the whole saga and said, "Some folks build kingdoms on other people's fear. Fear's a bad foundation." 2 weeks later, with her position gone, her marriage gone, and formal charges looming, Deborah made her most dangerous move yet. She showed up at Rose's house at 11 at night, uninvited, banging on the door hard enough that Rose's youngest woke up crying, demanding Rosa take back the lies before it ruined her life. Rosa, terrified, called Angela first out of instinct rather than 911. And Angela called me. I drove over in under 4 minutes, badge and all, and found Deborah still on the porch, disheveled in a way I'd never seen her, shouting through the door about ruined reputations and stolen legacies. This was different. I identified myself, kept my voice level despite every instinct telling me this had crossed from harassment into something that could turn dangerous fast, and asked her to step away from the door. For a moment she just stared at me, breathing hard, and I genuinely didn't know which way this would break. "You did this," she said, jabbing a finger toward me, voice cracking in a way that sounded less like anger now and more like grief for a version of her life that no longer existed. 8 years I kept this neighborhood together. 8 years. And tear it all down. We didn't tear anything down that wasn't already rotten, I told her. Calm but firm, the way I'd been trained to de-escalate without backing down. You did that yourself. One family at a time, for 8 years, before we ever moved in. She had no answer for that. She just started crying, ugly and unguarded. Officers arrived minutes later, responding to Rose's neighbor's call rather than mine, and took a full report of the incident: trespassing, harassment, a clear violation of the no-contact boundary Priya had already established in the civil complaint months earlier. Deborah didn't resist. She just sat on the curb, deflated, saying nothing further. That single act, showing up at Rose's house in the middle of the night, became the turning point in the criminal side of the case. It demonstrated, undeniably and on record, a willingness to escalate personally and physically once her institutional power disappeared.
Detective Ramirez called it the
Priya used the incident to file for an emergency protective order on Rose's behalf, granted within 48 hours given the documented pattern of retaliation. Deborah was now legally barred from contacting Rosa, from approaching her property, from any communication at all, a restriction that would have been unthinkable to her 8 months earlier. Meanwhile, the embezzlement investigation crossed a threshold Detective Ramirez had been waiting for: full corroboration between the HOA's altered financial statements, Deborah's personal bank deposits, and Richard's testimony about the account under her maiden name. The county prosecutor's office began reviewing the file for formal charges within the week. I stayed professionally distant from that part of it, careful not to let my personal stake compromise anything, letting Ramirez and the prosecutor's office handle it entirely by the book. But David, watching from the sidelines with his forensic accounting background, told me plainly, this isn't a maybe anymore. This is a when. Deborah, cornered on nearly every front, tried one final desperate maneuver, reaching out to a local news station rival to Rachel's outlet, offering an exclusive interview painting herself as the victim of a coordinated smear campaign led by a police captain abusing his authority to silence a concerned citizen. It backfired instantly. The station, to their credit, did their own basic research before airing anything and found Rachel's already published, fact-checked reporting, the fair housing investigation, the protective order, and the embezzlement case moving through the prosecutor's office. They declined to run Deborah's version, citing insufficient corroboration for her claims against documented public record. Undeterred, or perhaps simply out of options, Deborah posted a lengthy statement to the neighborhood group chat herself, the same one that had shared Rachel's article months earlier, accusing certain residents of orchestrating her downfall out of resentment and racial grievance rather than legitimate accountability. The replies were swift and largely unsympathetic. Mrs. now HOA president, replied publicly and simply, Deborah, we have the bank statements. We have the dispatch call. We have 7 families. This is just finally telling the truth. The post received more agreement reactions than anything posted in that group chat's entire history. Angela found Deborah's message strangely quiet in its own way, less enraged than exhausted, like a woman running out of narratives to try. I recognized the pattern from years of interviewing people cornered by their own choices. The anger comes first, loud and defensive, and eventually curdles into something smaller and more brittle. We learned through Tyler, who'd started spending more time at friends' houses than his mother's, that Deborah had stopped attending her usual social circuit entirely. No more garden club, no more charity luncheons. The informal network of status she'd built over a decade quietly closing ranks against her without a single public statement. Small towns and gated communities, I'd learned, don't always need dramatic confrontations to deliver consequences. Sometimes the punishment is simply silence, invitations that stop arriving, conversations that end when you approach. A life that used to be full of appointments suddenly, entirely empty. Deborah was living that silence now. Daily. The prosecutor's office formally filed charges 6 weeks after the confrontation at Rose's house. 3 counts of embezzlement. 1 count of filing a false police report tied to our cookout. And a harassment charge stemming from the protective order violation risk at Rose's door. Deborah was arraigned on a Tuesday morning. Alone. Richard didn't attend. though he'd cooperated fully with investigators throughout. Tyler didn't attend either, staying with a friend's family that week, unwilling to watch his mother walk into a courtroom in handcuffs even from a distance. It was, by every account I heard, quiet, almost anticlimactic hearing for something so long in the making. I didn't attend either, deliberately. I'd done everything by the book, kept my involvement professional and documented, and I didn't need to watch her arraignment to feel any sense of closure. Angela asked if I felt satisfied. I told her honestly that I mostly just felt tired, the way you do after a long shift. Rachel published her follow-up story the same week, more detailed now that the criminal case was public record, the embezzled funds, the fabricated election continuity, the pattern of targeted families stretching back at least 4 years. It didn't sensationalize. It didn't need to. More damage than any op-ed could. The story spread beyond the local outlet within days, picked up by a regional paper, then briefly by a national housing rights newsletter that used Brookhaven Ridge as a case study in how HOA power, left unchecked and unaccountable, becomes a tool for exactly the kind of discrimination it claims to prevent. Emeka called me after reading the national coverage, his voice lighter than I'd heard it in months. "We're not the only ones who'll read this and feel less crazy," he said. "That matters more than people think." I told him he was right, and that his willingness to speak up first had made all of it possible. Rosa, protected now by both the restraining order and a wave of community support she hadn't expected, told Angela she finally felt like she could sleep through a full night again without listening for a car slowing down outside. Small victories, but the kind that matter most in the aftermath of something like this. Deborah's house went up for sale 2 months later. A small, almost bitter irony given how many families she'd effectively priced or pressured out of that exact street over the years. Richard finalized the divorce quietly. Tyler chose to live with him full-time, enrolling in a new school district by winter. I watched the moving truck pull away from her driveway one Saturday morning while I refilled the bird feeder Otis had insisted we install on his last visit. No triumphant confrontation, no final words exchanged. Just a truck, a for sale sign, and a street that finally, quietly, started to feel like it belonged to everyone on it. The embezzlement case moved through pretrial proceedings over the following months, with David's financial documentation and the subpoenaed bank records forming the backbone of the prosecution's evidence. Deborah's attorney attempted several motions to suppress portions of the financial trail, all denied given how thoroughly the paper record had been assembled. The false police report charge carried its own weight in court, given how clearly the dispatch transcript demonstrated deliberate escalation language rather than a panicked misunderstanding. Officer Nguyen testified about the possible firearm phrasing and its automatic effect on response protocol, confirming what I'd suspected the very night it happened months earlier. I was called to testify as well, factual and restrained, describing the 11 minutes in my own backyard with my father-in-law's birthday cake sitting half-cut behind me, for officers with hands near their holsters, my niece crying against her mother's leg. I kept my voice steady. It wasn't easy, but I managed it. Deborah sat at the defense table throughout my testimony, staring at the surface of it rather than at me. The same posture Richard later told me she'd held through most of the proceedings, present, technically, but disengaged, as though acknowledging the reality of the room might make the consequences feel more permanent. The jury deliberated for just under 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts: embezzlement, filing a false police report, and harassment tied to the protective order incident. The embezzlement charge alone carried the heaviest weight, given the documented total exceeding $91,000 pulled from community funds over 3 years. Sentencing came a month later, restitution in full to the HOA. 18 months in county custody with the possibility of parole. 5 years of probation following release, and a permanent injunction barring her from ever serving on any homeowners association board again, anywhere in the state, for the rest of her life. I sat in the gallery for sentencing, Angela beside me, Rosa 2 rows back, Emeka having flown in again just to witness the end of something that had haunted 3 years of his life. When the judge read the injunction aloud, Rosa reached over and squeezed my hand without either of us saying anything. Outside the courthouse, Rachel caught up with us for a final quote, respectful as always about not pushing too hard for something dramatic. I kept it simple, I told her.
It was about making sure the next family that moves onto that.
Emeka said something similar, standing beside Rosa on the courthouse steps. 2 people who'd never met before this case had brought them together as unlikely allies. She made us feel like we didn't belong somewhere we'd earned, he said. Today, the record finally says we did. That's worth more than any apology, Mrs. Still serving as HOA president months into her term, used the verdict as the catalyst for a full bylaws rewrite, mandatory rotating leadership, transparent quarterly financial, reporting open to every homeowner, and an independent review process for any complaint involving a police response, designed specifically to prevent exactly what had happened to us. The community, chastened and more engaged than it had been in years, actually showed up to vote on the changes. A turnout Mrs. Alvarez said she hadn't seen since the neighborhood's founding 2 decades earlier. Fear, turned out, had kept people home for years. Once it lifted, people finally started paying attention. Rosa, months later, was elected to the newly restructured board herself, the first Latina resident ever to hold a position on it, running specifically on a platform of equal enforcement and transparency. She told Angela she never imagined herself in that role, but that someone needed to make sure this never happened to anyone else again. Emeka and his family, cautiously, began visiting the area again. First for Rachel's follow-up piece on the neighborhood's reforms, then simply as friends of ours. Invited to a cookout Angela and I threw specifically to reclaim the meaning of that word in our own backyard. Otis, of course, insisted on manning the smoker again. Malik and Tyler stayed in touch. Oddly, despite everything, 2 teenagers who'd never chosen the conflict between their families, meeting occasionally at school events. A quiet reminder that consequences fall hardest on the people who caused them, while the people caught in the fallout sometimes find their own way through it. Richard reached out once more, months after the divorce finalized, simply to say he was glad he'd made the choice to come forward when he did, even though it had cost him his marriage and reshaped his son's entire adolescence. I told him it had taken real courage, and that Brookhaven Ridge owed him more than it would ever fully acknowledge. I still think, sometimes, about how close that first night could have gone differently. A rookie officer without my history in the department, a dispatcher who didn't flag the call for confirmation, A version of me who didn't carry a badge to slow the moment down. Not every family gets that margin of safety. That thought became the reason I started. Quietly at first, volunteering with a regional initiative training dispatchers to better recognize escalation language in non-emergency calls. Using the Brookhaven Ridge transcript, anonymized, as a training case study. If the system could be weaponized that easily once, it needed to be harder to weaponize again. Angela, for her part, began speaking occasionally to community groups about her experience navigating fear inside your own home, careful never to center herself as the victim above Emeka or Rosa, always redirecting credit toward the neighbors who'd risked coming forward first when silence would have been so much easier. Otis, turning 71 the following June, insisted on another cookout, bigger this time, half the street showing up including families who'd once been too afraid to linger past a polite wave. Mrs. Amos Flan. Rosa brought her kids, calling it his second birthday too, in a way. Standing at the grill that second June, watching kids of every background splashing in the same inflatable pool that had once framed the worst afternoon of our lives, I felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't fully expected. Not triumph exactly, but something steadier, something closer to peace finally earned rather than given. Angela caught my eye across the yard, tongs in hand, and didn't need to say anything. We'd built this, not the house, not the street, but this specific afternoon, full and unafraid, out of 11 terrifying minutes almost 2 years earlier. Some things you can't get back. This one, somehow, we had. Priya wrapped up the civil fair housing settlement that fall, resulting in the HOA's insurer covering restitution to every affected family, including funds specifically earmarked to help the Okafors, should they ever choose to return, and a formal written acknowledgement from the newly reformed board of the harm caused under prior leadership. Emeka declined the return assistance offer, having built a good life 2 states over, but said the acknowledgement itself mattered more to him than any amount of money could have. I just wanted someone to say it happened, he told me. That it wasn't in my head. That part, finally, is done. Rosa used her portion of the settlement toward her youngest's college fund, telling Angela with a tired, genuine laugh that it felt strange to finally benefit from something that had cost her so many sleepless nights, but that she'd rather the money mean something than sit untouched out of some misplaced guilt. David eventually left his corporate accounting job to consult part-time with the same regional fair housing office that had investigated our case, saying he'd never felt work matter as directly as untangling Deborah's financial trail had.
He still teases me that I owe him for...
Tyler graduated high school 2 years later, and to everyone's mild surprise, chose a college with a strong criminal justice program, telling Malik at their shared graduation party that watching the whole ordeal unfold had taught him more about accountability than any classroom ever could. Some lessons, apparently, cut both directions. Deborah, released after serving her sentence, moved out of state entirely according to Richard, who mentioned it only once, briefly, without elaboration. Nobody in Brookhaven Ridge asked for details. Nobody particularly wanted them. The street had already moved past her more completely than any of us expected it could. This fast. This fully. I think about the version of that first night where I wasn't a police captain, where the responding officers didn't recognize my name, where the 11 minutes stretched into something no apology could ever undo. That version haunts me more than anything Deborah ever did directly, because it's the version too many families actually live. That's the real reason I kept pushing past the point where most people would have simply paid the fine and moved on, not just for my own family's sake,
but because somewhere, another Deborah is dialing a non-emergency line right now, choosing her words carefully, knowing exactly what those words will trigger.
The training program I helped build eventually expanded regionally, adopted by 3 neighboring counties within 18 months, each session opening with the same anonymized transcript. 5 o'clock, a birthday cake half-cut on the table, a meat thermometer mistaken, deliberately, for a rifle. Every new dispatcher who hears it asks the same question. How is this legal? It wasn't. In the end, not fully, the false report charge proved that much in court. But it took a police captain's badge, a forensic accountant brother, a fearless reporter, a betrayed husband, and for other families finding the courage to speak before the system finally, slowly, caught up to what should have been obvious from the start. That's the part that stays with me longest. Not the twist. Not the satisfaction of watching Deborah's composure finally crack at that podium, but the sheer number of ordinary people it took to hold one woman accountable for something that should never have required an army of witnesses to prove in the first place. Angela and I still host the June cookout every year now. An unofficial tradition the whole street looks forward to. Otis holding court from the same lawn chair. A little grayer each year but no less sharp. Mrs. is the flan. Rose's kids are taller every summer. Emeka flies in when he can. Malik started his freshman year of college that fall, deciding, somewhat to my surprise and enormous pride, to study public policy with a focus on housing law, telling me over his going-away dinner that watching Priya work our case had shown him a kind of justice that didn't require a badge or a courtroom robe. Zora, younger and quieter through most of it, surprised us both by writing her 8th grade history project on the case, using Rachel's articles as primary sources, presenting it to her class with a steadiness that made Angela cry a little in the back row, watching our daughter explain accountability like she'd always understood it. Mrs. down as HOA president after 4 years, citing her age and a well-earned desire to actually enjoy her retirement instead of managing bylaws. But the transparent, rotating leadership structure she'd championed stayed firmly in place, voted into permanent policy by a community that finally understood what unchecked power could cost. Rosa served 2 terms on the board before passing the role to someone else, saying she wanted the seat to keep circulating rather than becoming another version of what Deborah had built. The whole point, she told the group at her final meeting, was that no one gets to own this place alone again. I retired from active patrol supervision eventually, staying on in an administrative role that let me focus more on training and community relations, work that felt, in some strange way, like a continuation of everything Brookhaven Ridge had taught me about the gap between what the system allows and what it should actually protect. Gwyn, the rookie who'd once stood at my gate with his hand near his holster, made detective 4 years later, and told me at his promotion ceremony that the Brookhaven Ridge call had shaped how he approached every ambiguous dispatch since, always pausing, always asking one more question before assuming the worst about strangers. Richard remarried eventually, quietly, someone from his new city Tyler seemed genuinely fond of. He still sends a card around Otis's birthday every June. A small, strange gesture of gratitude for a family that had, in effect, upended his entire life and somehow left him better for it in the end. Emika's son, the same teenager who used to mow half the Brookhaven Ridge lawns before his family left, graduated college and, in a twist none of us saw coming, took a summer internship at the same regional fair housing office David consulted for, saying he wanted to make sure no other kid grew up watching his parents get chased out of a neighborhood. I keep the old case file still, tucked in a drawer at home rather than any department archive. Not because I need it anymore, but because it reminds me what patient, methodical documentation can actually accomplish against someone who mistakes cruelty for authority. Dates. Screenshots. Unglamorous architecture of real accountability. Some nights, grilling alone after everyone's gone to bed, I think about how easily this could have gone the other way. How many versions of this story end with a family who never gets the chance to fight back? A badge that never arrives in time. A truth that never makes it to daylight. But this version, our version, ended with Otis blowing out candles on his 71st birthday, surrounded by neighbors who used to be strangers and strangers who became something like family, on a street that finally, fully, belonged to everyone standing on it, exactly the way it always should have from the very first day. Deborah Ashworth built 8 years of unquestioned power on other people's fear, on rules she enforced selectively and broke whenever convenient, on the quiet assumption that no one watching closely enough would ever add up the pattern. She was wrong about that, in the end, in the most public way possible. It took a birthday cookout, a meat thermometer mistaken for a rifle, and 11 of the longest minutes of my life to finally set that reckoning in motion. But it happened. The record was corrected. And a neighborhood that once ran on silence learned, slowly, how to speak up instead. That, in the end, is the part one want people to remember most. Not the flashing lights, not the courtroom verdict, not even the satisfying image of Deborah's face going pale at that final HOA meeting. It's the 7 families who finally found each other and refused to stay quiet, together, until it counted, because that's really what broke her. Not one badge, not one captain, not one lucky coincidence of timing. It was an entire community finally choosing each other over fear. One uncomfortable conversation. One shared transcript. One brave testimony at a time. Until the silence she depended on for 8 years simply had nowhere left to hide. Angela still keeps a framed photo from that 2nd June cookout on our mantle. Otis midlaugh. Rosa's kids soaked from the pool. Emika and I standing by the smoker like old friends instead of strangers a lawsuit had brought together. Every time I look at it, I remember exactly what almost didn't happen. It didn't take vengeance to fix Brookhaven Ridge. It took patience, documentation, and neighbors willing to trust each other enough to finally speak the same uncomfortable truth out loud. Together, instead of alone. That, more than any badge or courtroom verdict, is what actually changed that street for good. I've told this story a handful of times since, mostly to new officers I train, always ending the same way, that the badge slowed things down for my family that day, but it shouldn't have had to. Nobody's safety should depend on who happens to answer the door when the flashing lights arrive. That's the reckoning I carry forward now. The reason the training keeps expanding. The reason Rosa still serves quietly on committees. The reason Emeka still calls every June just to hear how the cookout went. Not because the fight is over everywhere, but because on our street, at least, it finally, truly is. 2 summers after the sentencing, I got a call I genuinely didn't expect. A producer from a true crime podcast wanting to feature the case, framing it around HOA power abuse nationally. I hesitated, wary of turning something this personal into entertainment. But Priya convinced me the reach could help other families recognize the pattern early. We agreed on strict conditions. Rosa's full name only with her renewed consent. Nothing sensationalized. No dramatized reenactments. Just the documented facts laid out plainly. The episode released that fall, and within weeks, 3 separate families from unrelated states reached out to Rachel, describing eerily similar patterns in their own HOA-run communities. One message stood out immediately. A woman in Ohio describing an HOA president who'd called police over a suspicious gathering that turned out to be her son's graduation party, using nearly identical escalation language to Deborah's original dispatch call. The parallel wasn't coincidence. It was a playbook, apparently more common than any of us realized. I connected her with Priya, who took the case pro bono alongside a partner firm, using our documentation as a template for building the complaint quickly. Within 4 months, that HOA president resigned under pressure once residents organized using the exact same public meeting strategy that had worked in Brookhaven Ridge 2 years earlier. It became something like an informal network after that. Families finding each other through Rachel's reporting, through the podcast, through word of mouth, sharing documentation strategies, connecting with sympathetic lawyers, refusing to let isolated intimidation work the way it always had before anyone compared notes. Deborah, without meaning to, had taught us all how the pattern operated. Emeka started speaking publicly at housing policy conferences, something he told me he never imagined himself doing 3 years earlier when he'd sold his house at a loss just to escape. I used to think leaving quietly was the safest thing, he said at one panel.
Now I think staying quiet.
Rosa, still serving on the reformed Brookhaven Ridge Board, started fielding calls herself from other HOA members nationwide, asking how their community had rebuilt trust and transparency after something like this. She always gave the same answer: rotating leadership, open books, and a board that fears its own residents' scrutiny more than it fears change. Mrs. well into her 70s now and thoroughly retired from board duties, still keeps a framed newspaper clipping of Rachel's original article on her hallway wall, right next to photos of her grandchildren. Proudest thing I ever did, she told me once, was finally saying something after years of staying quiet. I think, honestly, that's the twist underneath all the other twists in this story. Not the badge, not the embezzlement, not even the arrest. It's that an ordinary widow who'd watched injustice happen next door for years finally found her voice, and that one small act of courage helped unravel everything else that followed. Deborah, wherever she is now, likely still believes she was simply protecting a community she'd built. I don't know if she'll ever understand the difference between protecting a place and controlling the people in it through fear. Some people, I've learned, never quite make that distinction, no matter how much evidence sits in front of them. I don't spend much energy anymore wondering whether she's changed. That was never really the point of any of this. The point was making sure the next family that moves onto a quiet street with a smoker and a birthday cake doesn't have to wonder if celebrating in their own backyard will end with guns drawn. Angela says I still get quiet every June, right before the cookout, running through some old instinct to double-check the fence line, the noise level, the parked cars, even though there's no one watching anymore with binoculars and a spreadsheet. Old fears take time to fully unclench, even after the reason for them is long gone. This year, though, something different happened. A new family moved in 3 houses down. A young Filipino couple with a toddler, nervous during their first HOA meeting, visibly bracing for the kind of scrutiny Emeka's family once endured. Mrs. to knock on their door, welcome basket in hand. Rosa organized a small potluck to introduce them properly. No forms, no violation notices, no laminated ordinance printouts left on their porch. Just neighbors, food, and an afternoon that felt entirely, blessedly ordinary. The exact kind of afternoon Deborah had once made feel dangerous for anyone who didn't fit her narrow idea of belonging. Watching that new family relax over the course of one afternoon, shoulders slowly dropping from wary to comfortable, I understood something I hadn't fully grasped even after the verdict. The settlement, the podcast, the training program. The real victory was never the courtroom. It was this, an ordinary Tuesday where nobody had to prove they belonged. I still keep Officer Nguyen's old business card in my desk drawer. The one he handed me shaking slightly in my own driveway that first terrifying afternoon. Detective Nguyen now, 4 years into the promotion, still calls occasionally just to talk through difficult calls, saying our case remains the clearest lesson he ever learned on the job. You taught me to slow down before assuming the worst, he told me recently, over coffee near the precinct. I told him it wasn't really me who taught him that. It was 11 minutes in my own backyard, a meat thermometer, and a woman who'd learned exactly which words made a dispatcher's hand move fastest. That's the piece of this story I keep coming back to. The twist that still unsettles me most even years later. Deborah didn't stumble into what she did. She learned the system's weak points deliberately, refined her methods across multiple families, and very nearly succeeded in making it look, each time, like an honest mistake. It took a captain's badge to survive her first attempt. It took a forensic accountant, a fearless reporter, a betrayed husband, a widow's courage, and 4 separate families comparing notes before the truth finally outweighed her polish. That imbalance, how much it took to stop one determined person, still troubles me more than her original crime. Priya says that imbalance is exactly why reform matters more than punishment alone. Why the training programs and rotating leadership requirements matter as much as Deborah's conviction did. Removing one bad actor fixes one street. Changing the structure that let her operate unchecked for 8 years protects every street that comes after it. I agree with her. Mostly. Though some nights I still just feel the simpler, older satisfaction of watching a woman who once measured my grass with her eyes lose absolutely everything she'd built on other people's fear. Both things can be true. Justice can be structural and still, occasionally, deeply, personally satisfying. Malik, home from college for winter break, asked me recently if I ever think about how differently it could have gone if I hadn't been a police captain that day. I told him the truth. That thought visits me more than almost any other memory from those 2 years, and probably always will. That's exactly why I'm studying this, he said. gesturing vaguely at the stack of housing policy textbooks on his desk. So it doesn't have to depend on who happens to answer the door. I didn't have anything to add to that. My son had already said it better than I ever could. Zora, now in high school herself, still occasionally references the case in class discussions, telling her teacher once that the biggest lesson she took from watching it unfold wasn't about villains or heroes, but about how many ordinary people it takes, working together, to fix something one person spent years quietly breaking. Rachel eventually left local reporting for a national housing policy beat, crediting the Brookhaven Ridge story as the case that redirected her entire career. She still sends a card every June, usually with a single line. Hope Otis's birthday was as loud and unbothered as it deserves to be this year. Otis, 74 now and slower on his feet but no less sharp in conversation, still insists on manning the smoker every June, waving off every offer of help with the same line he's used for years. I fought for this backyard once already, he says. I'll fight for it every summer if I have to. The neighborhood group chat, once dominated by Deborah's clipped, procedural warnings, now mostly features borrowed lawn tools, lost dog alerts, and increasingly elaborate debates over the best barbecue rub. The kind of aggressively mundane conversation that once felt impossible on that street, and now feels like the whole point of winning. I think about Deborah less often than people probably assume, given how much of my life those 2 years reshaped. Mostly what stays with me isn't her. It's Emika's voice cracking on the word belonged. Rose's hands shaking around her notes. Mrs. Alvarez knocking on a stranger's door with a welcome basket instead of a complaint. That's the real ending of this story. I think the one that matters more than any courtroom verdict. Not a villain finally punished, though that mattered too, but a street that relearned, slowly and imperfectly, how to actually be a neighborhood, the kind where a cookout is just a cookout, and belonging isn't something you have to prove. Angela and I sold nothing, moved nowhere, stayed exactly where we'd planted ourselves that first hopeful spring. And eventually that stubbornness became its own kind of answer to everything Deborah had tried to make us believe about whether we belonged there. We're still here. More than any verdict, feels like the actual victory. Some nights, standing at the same grill where it all started, I catch myself scanning the street out of old habit, the instinct never fully gone even years later. But what I see now is just ordinary life, kids on bikes, a new family settling in 3 doors down, gospel music low enough not to bother anyone. And every June, without fail, we do it again, the smoker, the folding chairs, the string lights, Otis holding court, a street full of neighbors who no longer flinch at the sound of a car slowing down out front. It's not a grand ending. It's just an ordinary, hard-won, thoroughly unremarkable afternoon. Exactly as it always should have been. Detective Ramirez, wrapping up her career a decade after the case, told me once it remained the clearest example she'd ever worked of institutional power turned into a personal weapon, and the clearest example of how slowly, patiently, and collectively it actually takes to dismantle something like that once it's been allowed to root that deep. I've since testified twice more in similar cases regionally, brought in as an expert witness on dispatch escalation patterns, each time walking a new jury through the same uncomfortable arithmetic, how few words it actually takes to turn a birthday party into an armed response, And how rarely anyone questions those words in the moment. Gwyn, now training rookies of his own, uses our case as the very first lesson in his own field training curriculum, the same way I once used other captains' hard lessons to train him. Feels, in a strange full-circle way, like the whole ordeal eventually taught more people than it ever hurt. Given enough time, Richard still sends that card every June. And last year included a photo of Tyler at his college graduation, criminal justice degree in hand, standing beside him with a proud, slightly sheepish grin. On the back, in Richard's careful handwriting, he wants to make sure no one uses a badge or a bylaw to hurt people again. I keep that card. Same drawer as the old case file. Same drawer as Nguyen's original business card. A strange little archive of everyone this story eventually touched and changed. For better, over the years that followed. Some cases close and stay closed. This one, somehow, kept quietly rippling outward long after the courtroom emptied. Emeka's son finished his fair housing internship and stayed on full-time, working now on exactly the kind of early intervention casework that might have spared his own family 3 years of quiet torment, had it existed back then. He told me once, half joking, that Deborah accidentally created the career that would eventually help stop people like her. I laughed at that, though it wasn't entirely a joke. Deborah Ashworth, in trying so hard to control who belonged on one quiet street, ended up training a police captain, a forensic accountant, a housing reporter, a widow-turned-president, a future fair housing lawyer, and a whole informal network of families who now recognize her tactics instantly. Anywhere. That's not redemption. And I've never once offered it to her, not even privately. But it is, undeniably, consequence stretched further than she ever imagined it could reach. Every family she once tried to erase now standing more visible, more protected, more connected than they ever were before she targeted them. Sometimes justice doesn't look like a single dramatic moment. It looks like a decade of quiet aftershocks, a training program here, a reformed bylaw there, a teenager choosing a career because he watched his mother's mistakes get exposed in a courtroom. It looks like an ordinary June afternoon that no one has to defend anymore. I retired fully from the department 2 years ago, spending most of my time now consulting on exactly this kind of community-level accountability work. Traveling occasionally to speak at the same housing conferences Emeka frequents. We usually end up on the same panel eventually. 2 men who never expected a cookout to define their careers. Angela still works ER shifts, though fewer now, and still tells the story sometimes to new nurses navigating their own difficult neighbors, always ending with the same advice: document everything, trust your instincts, and never assume the system will simply correct itself without someone pushing it patiently in the right direction first. Malik graduated with his housing policy degree last spring, taking a position with the same regional fair housing office David still consults for part-time, meaning 3 members of our family now work, in different ways, on preventing exactly what happened to us from happening again to someone else. Otis calls us the family business now, only half joking. Zora, still in high school, says she wants to be a journalist like Rachel, tired of watching injustice happen quietly and unrecorded. Rachel, when she heard that, mailed Zora an old reporter's notebook with a note inside: "The truth doesn't defend itself. Somebody has to write it down first." Might as well be you. We still host the cookout every June. Bigger now than it's ever been. 3 generations of families who found each other through the worst afternoon of our lives now gathering every summer through the best ones instead. Otis, 76 this year, still insists on the smoker, though Malik quietly does most of the actual work now. Rose's youngest, once a toddler crying through Deborah's midnight banging on their door, graduates high school this year, headed to study social work, saying she barely remembers the fear anymore, just the community that eventually formed around fixing it. Fear fades. Turns out, when enough people refuse to let it define the whole story. Mrs. Peacefully 2 winters ago, 91 years old, and the entire street showed up for her memorial, a turnout she genuinely would have been shocked by, given how invisible she'd felt on that street for years before finally speaking up. We planted a magnolia tree in her honor at the community entrance. The plaque beneath it, chosen by unanimous board vote, reads simply, "For the neighbor who finally said something." No name needed beneath it. Everyone on that street, old and new, knows exactly whose courage it honors, and exactly what it cost her to finally break 8 years of comfortable, complicit silence. Deborah Ashworth, as far as any of us know, never returned to Brookhaven Ridge, never reached out, never acknowledged any of it beyond her sentencing statement, which even then focused more on her own suffering than the families she'd spent years terrorizing. Some people, turns out, simply never learned the lesson their own downfall was meant to teach. That's fine. Needed her to learn it for the street to heal. The healing happened anyway, slowly, built by everyone who chose to stay, to speak up, to welcome the next nervous new family instead of measuring their grass and calling the police over a birthday cake and a meat thermometer. I think about that 11 minutes less as trauma now and more as the origin point of everything that followed, a career shift, a marriage tested and strengthened, a widow's late life courage, a teenager's entire chosen profession, a network of families who no longer face this kind of intimidation completely alone or unheard. If you'd told me that afternoon, hands raised, watching 4 officers clear my own backyard for a non-existent weapon, that it would eventually lead here, a magnolia tree, a training curriculum, 3 generations gathering every June without fear, I don't think I would have believed you. Grief rarely announces its eventual purpose in advance. But that's exactly what happened. One patient, unglamorous step at a time. Not vengeance, confrontation, though there were a few of those along the way. Just documentation, community, and enough ordinary people refusing to accept that fear was simply the cost of living in your own home. That was always enough. Angela asked me recently if I'd do anything differently, looking back on all of it. I told her honestly, no, not the caution, not the patience, not the months spent quietly building a file instead of confronting Deborah directly and losing the advantage of proof. Slow and thorough beat fast and satisfying. Every single time it mattered. The only thing I'd change, if I could, is the existence of the problem itself, that any family needs a badge, a lawyer, a reporter, and years of patient documentation just to prove that a birthday cookout was never a threat. That shouldn't be the bar. But until it isn't, I'll keep doing this work. Rosa still calls occasionally, usually in June, usually just to say the cookout smells the same as it always has, hickory smoke drifting between houses that finally fully feel like a neighborhood instead of a territory someone else claimed ownership over. Small, ordinary, hard-won normalcy. That's what we were actually fighting for the whole time. Emeka still flies in most years, calling it his second family reunion. Standing at the fence line where Deborah once watched us through binoculars, now just watching his own kids splash in the same pool Zora used to cannonball into as a little girl. Time, given enough patience, does eventually heal what fear tried to break. And every June, standing at that same grill, I still think, just for a moment, about the 4 officers who once walked up my driveway with their hands near their holsters, and about how far one determined, terrified, furious family, and the community that eventually rallied around them, managed to travel from that single unbearable afternoon. In the years since, Brookhaven Ridge became something of a quiet case study cited in 2 statewide fair housing training manuals, not for the drama of it, but for the mechanics, how one person's unchecked authority metastasized, and exactly which structural changes finally stopped it. Deborah's name appears nowhere in those manuals. The lessons do. Priya still practices housing law, taking on 2 similar cases a year on average, always citing Brookhaven Ridge's documentation strategy as the template: corroborate early, protect witnesses, let the paper trail speak louder than outrage ever could. She says our case taught her more about patience than law school ever managed to. David still consults part-time for the Fair Housing Office, occasionally lecturing accounting students on forensic financial review, always opening with the same line: the most dangerous fraud isn't hidden. It's just labeled boring enough that nobody bothers to look twice. Deborah's landscaping line items taught him that lesson permanently. Gwyn still keeps the original dispatch transcript, redacted now for training purposes, in his own curriculum folder, telling every new class of rookies the same thing I once told him in the field: slow down, ask one more question, and never let someone else's fear decide who deserves a hand near a holster. The magnolia tree at the community entrance bloomed early this spring, full and white against the new sign the Reformed Board installed beside it: Brookhaven Ridge Homeowners Association. Under original charter, reformed under community vote. A small, deliberate reminder that the neighborhood story didn't end with Deborah. It began again after her. We still gather every June, louder each year, hickory smoke drifting over a street that finally, fully belongs to everyone standing on it. Proof, if anyone still needed it, that patience, documentation, and a community willing to finally speak up together can outlast even the most determined, most entrenched abuse of power. Looking back now, years removed from that first terrifying afternoon, I understand the real story was never really about one Karen, one HOA, or even one badge that happened to slow the worst outcome down. It was about what ordinary people can accomplish when they finally refuse to let fear write the whole story alone. Otis still blows out his candles every June, a little slower each year, surrounded by a street full of people who used to be strangers and a family that refused to be chased out of a home they'd earned. The smoke still smells like hickory. The cake still gets cut too early. Some things, thankfully, never change. Brookhaven Ridge belongs to everyone who lives there now, exactly as it always should have. And every June the backyard fills again with laughter, gospel music, and the unshakable, ordinary joy of a family that simply refused to disappear quietly. That, in the end, was the only victory that ever truly mattered.